Hello there, friends, and welcome back to The Well-Oiled Mind. Today, we're exploring three of the main root causes for one of history's most devastating conflicts, World War I. Examining past conflicts can give us insights into wars that loom on today's horizons. As Mark Twain said, history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. When we think about World War I, most people have heard about the spark which kicked things off. The spark, of course, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. In today's video, however, we're going to look at the underlying, not just the immediate causes for this global catastrophe. With that being said, let's do this. The first major cause of World War I was militarism. Militarism is an approach by a nation which is highlighted by the development and maintenance of a strong military capability. The real hallmark of militarism, however, is the willingness, and some might say the intent, to actually use this capability in an aggressive fashion. In the years leading up to World War I, Europe experienced a massive arms race. The engine behind this race was the Second Industrial Revolution, which took place from approximately 1870 to 1914. This start date of 1870 roughly coincides with the 1871 unification of the German states, which, in an instant, altered the balance of power on the European continent. All of a sudden, there was a new and powerful state that had to be reckoned with. By 1914, leveraging new technologies and ample natural resources, the major powers, especially Germany and Britain, were building up enormous military stockpiles. This race for military dominance was driven by fear and competition. Historian Michael Howard lays out the general consensus regarding the German imperial ambitions. In his book, War in European History, he shows that Germany's leaders, influenced by the writings of military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, believed that war was not only inevitable, but desirable for asserting their power. Let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves this question. Do we see any states pursuing such an approach today? Are revanchist powers like Russia or rising powers like China following these 100-year-old footsteps, perhaps? Well, it's good food for thought, to be sure. An interesting site to help you examine this a bit more, if you want to, is the Global Conflict Tracker. Check it out in the description. Now, let's get back to pre-World War I Europe. Countries like Britain, France, and Russia, meanwhile, were really uneasy about Germany's rising military power, and they expanded their armies as a response. So, Europe was essentially a powder keg now bracing against the inevitable spark. Another key factor that led to World War I was a web of alliances that overlaced Europe. In the decades before the war, Europe's great powers formed two major alliances. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance, while Britain, France, and Russia formed the Triple Entente. These alliances were designed as defensive measures, but they had an unintended consequence. They created a latent domino effect. Any conflict involving one of these nations could easily pull the others in, turning a small incident into a full-blown war, which is, of course, exactly what happened. The historian Margaret MacMillan, in her book, The War That Ended Peace, describes this alliance system as, quote, a house of cards, unquote. Once one nation fell into conflict, the alliances would drag the others along with it. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in July 1914, the network of alliances quickly activated. Russia, Serbia's ally, mobilized against Austria-Hungary. In Germany, Austria's ally, declared war on Russia. Just days later, Germany invaded Belgium, pulling Britain into the war. Using the domino analogy, once the first tile fell, the conflict assumed a momentum that no one proved capable of resisting. Now, let's move on to the final major cause. The third cause we'll discuss is competitive nationalism. Competitive nationalism, which is not the same as patriotism, surged in the 19th and 20th centuries all across Europe. This sort of nationalism was driven by envy more than pride. It was fueled more by fear of others than love of self. This corrupted strain of nationalism was covetous and suspicious and led to a highly degenerative form of competition among the European countries. Competitive nationalism not only fueled domestic pride, which saw others with disdain, but it also led to aggressive foreign policies and territorial ambitions. Germany and Italy had unified only in the latter half of the 19th century, and both nations were eager to prove themselves on the European stage. Meanwhile, ethnic tensions within the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were at a boiling point. Many ethnic groups like the Serbs sought independence and saw Austria-Hungary as an obstacle. Historians such as Fischer argue that Germany's aggressive nationalism and desire for a, quote, place in the sun, unquote, contributed to this desire for dominance. Similarly, Serbia's nationalist fervor, particularly among the group known as the Black Hand, led to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, a spark that finally ignited the conflict. So, militarism, alliances, and competitive nationalism were the three main causes that created an environment ripe for war. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand wasn't the root cause, but rather the spark that ignited Europe's pre-existing and long-standing tensions. Having now looked at the root causes for the war, let's switch gears a little bit and examine the legacy and aftermath that we can still see today. World War I didn't just end with the Treaty of Versailles. Its impacts are still visible over a century removed. First, the map of Europe was redrawn, and empires that had ruled for centuries, like the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, declined or simply dissolved. This reshaping of Europe created countries that we know today, but also left unresolved ethnic tensions, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Additionally, World War I introduced the concept of total war, where civilian populations were involved in an unprecedented scale. This idea transformed future conflicts and paved the way for World War II. Economically, the heavy reparations imposed on Germany created resentment, economic instability, and as historians like Richard Evans suggest, helped set the stage for the rise of extremist movements, including Nazism. The exorbitant reparations also demonstrated a model of how an alliance can win the war but lose the peace. Surely this is a model to avoid. So the roots of World War I go beyond just one assassination. Deep-seated issues and movements like militarism, alliances, and competitive nationalism set the stage for one of the most destructive wars in history. And even now, over a century later, we continue to feel its ripple effects. Thanks for joining us today and exploring this chapter of history. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share. Let's keep the discussions going so we never forget the lessons of the past. And remember, knowledge is its own reward.